Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm consciously aware I'm the last speaker, but I'd like to start by thanking CPI for the invite to BILD and for me to come and speak to you. I know that you've had a very intensive and knowledge-filled 2 days. Fantastic lineup of speakers speaking from all angles. Some people who've obviously been involved in a lot of very recent and at the forefront of their national progress of restraint reduction initiatives. And now you've got me. But the qualifiers to that are that in a previous life I was a CPI instructor for a good 5 years, and also it's the last one of the day, and so if it isn't as energetic and as invigorating as the chair expects, then you can all walk away at the end of it, and if it is, great, it's a win-win for you, probably more at stake for me. So I was asked to talk today really about from the perspective of kind of an overarching governance approach to training in the area of restraint reduction and restrictive physical interventions particularly. And that's kind of in the context of this tsunami of industry and action, guidance, policy, etc. that's developed over the last couple of years. And a scheme which we at BILD have organised and run for 13 years, against that backdrop of ever-changing policy and guidance, with a fairly clear focus around adults and children with learning disability, autistic spectrum disorder, children with associated behavioural difficulties, children and adults with dual diagnosis. But it still remains, as it always has, a voluntary scheme, following that tidal wave of guidance, etc. And one of the questions we continue to pose is, as a sector, when I say we, are we happy with that? Are we satisfied that that's the approach? So just to kind of think then about the current position. BILD's current position, as many of you will know, is a long and hard-working history in terms of restraint reduction initiatives, practice sharing, and more recently developing and disseminating the evidence base for proactive approaches like positive behaviour support. In fact, the first code of practice, written back in 2001, was actually set against the backdrop of developed national guidance because following events of national scandal and outcry. How times haven't changed. Unfortunately, those sorts of events, it seems that at those points it's the peak when the most industry happens, and it's potentially where the biggest leaps forward take, but we're not certain that it actually necessarily leads to significant change in the long term. So if we shift the focus slightly and think about these repeated incidents in history, think behind the acts, which nobody's ever going to condone, nor disassociate from words such as scandal, abuses of position, criminality in some aspects, but on a very simplistic level, thinking about restrictive practices actually as a failure in our demand. If we think of that, if that's our position and our focus to start with, that restrictive practices occur because we fail to meet the needs of people that we support. And if we take learning at an individual level, at a team level, at an organisation level, and even at a systems level when people are developing guidance and policy, then perhaps we begin to recognise that sometimes there are needs that we don't meet, there's sometimes needs that we can't meet. And I think it's appropriate to put in the adage that we can't make people behave, but we can create the environments, the physical, the relational and the emotional environments that make it more likely that people will behave in acceptable ways. And if we get into that position and that focus in terms of restraint reduction, then we're thinking about organisations working towards organisational restraint reduction. For us, we're very clear that training and development of the workforce, that remains a significant cog in the machine, and I think it's of paramount importance right across any sector within health and social care. The standard of the training, I think everybody is clear, and even the guidance now supports, is the responsibility of the entire sector. We at BILD will continue to strive to ensure that our scheme is a driving force within some of this. So in talking about accreditation and action and influence, it got me thinking about accreditation as a word. Who's doing it and what are they doing? So just taking a typical, and I said a typical trip for a BILD manager coming up to conference today. It's actually a couple of weeks ago on the same trip up to Birmingham. But in terms of who's accrediting, and what do they accredit, and what's the basis for accreditation? Why do we have this plethora of stuff? And it came up with some really interesting ones. I won't go through all of these, but it certainly set my mind wondering why there was a need for certain accreditations. So as everybody goes off to the train station today with your ticket, and it's all printed up in your orange and yellow colours, and it's got all the legal guidance on the background about you can't get on an early train because you've only booked the one that you booked onto. Those tickets come out of regulated and accredited machines, and it starts making your mind wonder why. Then you think about that actually accreditation normally comes from aspects of safety. It comes from the viewpoint of an ethical position. It sets expectations for different parts of a sector or an industry, and it sometimes sets quite a clear legal framework to operate within. It talks about partnership working in some acts, and fundamentally it's about meeting the needs of people. There's a reason to reach a certain set of standards based on the needs of individuals. Sometimes you come across competing accreditation. The one that stopped me in my tracks was the Green Touristy Business Scheme, the largest green tourism accreditation in the world, which suggests that there's smaller ones happening as well. I often hear in conversations that I'm part of, or sometimes not part of, a distant kind of criticism of the BILD accreditation scheme, bearing in mind it's a voluntary scheme and nobody's expecting that anybody has to, nobody's mandated that anybody has to come to us and seek accreditation. But and often a criticism would be that the BILD accreditation has a low floor and a very high ceiling, is the phrase that's often bandied around. So that made me go looking for one similar, and I came across the Seaside accreditation for Blackpool accommodation. So it made me realise that actually a lot of criticism, sometimes it's not relevant, but it certainly is relative. The recent developments which BILDs were a part of in terms of national guidance, I know speakers previous have talked about what those developments are and perhaps what the 2-year programme Positive and Safe is looking to achieve over the short term. However, there was the opportunity in that, and conversations, many conversations, long and ranging, suggesting that there was a need for nationally agreed standards, for mandatory training accreditation, and for external validation. The opportunity, unfortunately, has been missed for whatever reason, possible implications of a government view on that. However, the accreditation scheme is set within the guidance as one other accreditation scheme is. And so off the back of that, people have, again, across the sector, realising that the last guidance around restrictive physical intervention focused specifically around learning disability and autism. The cross-sector guidance now has led to people inquiring what is the accreditation, what does it look for, and what's it trying to achieve. So if we look to the future, the Code of Practice was launched last month at BILD's Positive Behaviour Support Conference, and, pardon the pun, builds on the previous iterations of the code itself. The foremost part of it for us is that it continues to push the expectations of not only training organisations but individuals who are delivering the training and perhaps significantly organisations who are purchasing the training. We recognise that the scheme and the code itself were originally set up to drive improvements in training, particularly to people whose services were working with individuals whose behaviour challenges. And those who were using restrictive physical interventions, and it had a fairly narrow focus and remit. With the new guidance speaking to the whole sector, it's perhaps timely then that we refocus specific emphasis around organisational responsibilities for the standards of an expectations in terms of support, in terms of documentation, in terms of staff and workforce development to support challenging behaviour. And it's also important to recognise that those responsibilities aren't a throwaway comment in the commissioning of training specifically. It's been said that the scheme had failed to reduce restraint through training, but that was never the intention. The intention is actually to ensure that people see training as a significant part of any restraint reduction initiative, and therefore putting the emphasis on the organisations to take up that challenge of organisational restraint reduction and to adhere to their responsibility to the code if they're using training that is accredited. The entire first section is given over to the responsibilities of the purchasing organisation, and that sets out the clarity of the framework that they need to assess, support, record and document their behaviour support. And it drives, in terms of BILD's work, it drives our ongoing conversation with commissioners that, again, from a perspective that there are services for people with dementia, people with mental health, that will come seeking accreditation and look to BILD for accreditation on the mainstay that the commissioner has said we want the training to be BILD accredited, without any kind of education and background knowledge on what that actually means and what that implicitly means for organisations who are using BILD accredited training. So it drives those conversations with commissioners and regulators to say, first and foremost, who's looked at your training that's getting delivered by the providers that you're commissioning. There's further work being developed, again, from a learning disabilities perspective, on the joint specification between ADAS and NHS England in relation to services supporting challenging behaviour. There are, again, educational parts to working with commissioners and regulators to really understand what is that specification asking for. It's not literally asking for a rubber stamp of a badge against from accreditation. It's actually looking at the whole framework and the context in which restrictive physical interventions are delivered. So there's got to be something that then supports it. It's I say, voluntary scheme. Currently, having just had 2 panels last week, 42 organisations across the UK accredited through the scheme on a voluntary basis. From a market probably of around 650, 700 organisations delivering this. So again, in terms of that conversation with commissioners, if only 42 can recognise that they've met a consistent set of standards and have sought that accreditation and been given that stamp, what are the other 650 doing? Who's looked into their training, who's satisfied themselves as the content of it, the context that it's delivered in, and the framework that the organisations are operating in that are using that kind of training. Trainers alone can't deliver the improvements, but training does play a crucial role in setting the tone of providing support to people whose behaviour challenges. It's a crucial aspect that training organisations and trainers continue to get good support in relation to developing themselves professionally and purposefully as trainers. That's got to be fully supported by the organisational leadership, and they need to recognise the role that training plays in organisational restraint reduction and recognise that it's not the only but nonetheless integral component part to it, and not simply recognise that training is sometimes a bolt-on to people's already busy roles. So we're committed to developing systems and support mechanisms that recognise people as trainers, as professional trainers within this industry. So the reinvigoration and development of the provider forum and the network of support going forward means that not only accredited organisations but those seeking accreditation will be able to access that network of support, that practice sharing, that problem solving arena. There'll be many that decide it's not for them. We're acutely aware that within the sector of training delivery there are some very commercially sensitive parts to the work. However, there are plenty of people who want to collaborate and work together and share information, particularly about restraint reduction and evidence for that. Really pleased to hear of the work of the Restraint Reduction Network from CPI's point of view, because that fits absolutely with our ideals for engagement and CPD of on-site trainers specifically. We're very clear that the accreditation extends to the organisation and to their employed and full-time, part-time based trainers. However, it doesn't extend, the quality assurance from BILD's point of view doesn't extend into the on-site trainers, but there's still plenty that we can do to support those people, to recognise that actually within what we're moving towards in terms of an ideal of sector-led improvement and almost mandating of accreditation, be it BILD or be it from other organisations, a sector-led mandate for that, to say actually, first and foremost, we want people to have a look at our training. There's nothing to hide in terms of the context, the ethics, the morals and the values of our training delivery. And there are things that accrediting organisations such as BILD can do to support those things. So, development of Trainers Academy, that'll include dissemination action learning sets, regional workshops, etc. for those on-site trainers who specifically want their CPD to go in the direction of developing more of an understanding around this aspect of their work currently and taking that forward. And as the sector reacts to the launch of the guidance in March, April, and as they take forward things like emerging guidance through the NICE Clinical Guideline Development groups and this banner of positive and safe over the 2 years, that this will be a fundamental place for trainers to get involved in that CPD and development. The other area I'd like to talk about just briefly, which may support the sharing and the practice learning and again the sector-led improvements in this area for people who maybe haven't been involved with the evidence base and the growing evidence base, particularly from a learning disability point of view that then can be applied in other aspects of people's work, is the Centre for Advancement of Positive Behaviour Support. This essentially is a hub for gathering intelligence and providing practice-based feedback and exchange and signposting people. If you imagine that in this room today, all of the organisations who using one of the accredited organisations, the span and web of influence of yourselves as people within an organisation, for those of you who are trainers of this model, the span and influence that extends to across the health and social care landscape is significant, it's huge. And of course then thinking about all of those organisations who we don't know what training models they use, more significantly we don't know the content of those training models. But this is about bringing all of that knowledge, research, practice-based evidence together and disseminating it and having a focal point for people to come to and use things which do have an evidence base, share those problems that there'll be people in this room that are sharing exactly the same issues as people sat on the other side of the room, and this can be the focal point to drive the dissemination of that. It's a platform also for providing insights and the innovations that need to be developed in relation to our mission, our positive behaviour support mission to drastically reduce restraint. There isn't at the moment, off the back of the launch of the guidance in April, any kind of baseline for the UK to say this is what we're doing in terms of restraint. This is how much we use restraint. These are the range of restrictive practices that we use within our settings. So for a 2-year programme to see if there is any effect, unfortunately there's no baseline to kind of pose that against. Again, this can influence that, it can support that, it can also draw in the international perspectives that we need, again from restraint reduction across the globe, ways that we know have worked and have had influence on drastically reducing the use of restrictive practices. So the international perspectives is a big part of it. That's driven by PBS as an international approach with huge developments in lots of different sectors. Most significantly, probably at the moment, in terms of influence, is things like the American-based, school-wide based positive behaviour support, the Euro PBS network. All of that practice sharing can be brought together into one place and be shared with people who day to day, day in, day out, are working through the same issues of how do we use less restrictive practices, how do we move to a more proactive way of supporting behaviour that challenges. So the collection of data is a huge aspect. At the moment, I'm here talking with you in Birmingham. There's a delegation of people from BILD over in Australia and New Zealand talking about those international perspectives, talking about things like the state-led restraint reduction initiatives in 3 states of Australia. The data and the information that we need to share from that and disseminate back to people who are working in services, training individuals, working at organisational approach to restraint reduction, all means that the good practice sharing and that exchange can really flourish. 3 things particularly that we'll be doing going forward is the development of a CPD framework, specifically around positive behaviour support. That's a bit of a listening exercise at the moment in relation to how positive and safe pans out. Promoting exchanges, and the ultimate aim is to eventually create fellowships where actually we have an international web of known research and practice applicable across lots of different settings, achieving the same outcome of restraint reduction. The next steps of that for people who wish to be involved may have particular interest in researching these approaches, collaborating with people who've gone through the same issues. 18th of September we'll be publicising that wider, but there will be a point where we get people of equal mind together to consider what are the next steps in terms of how will this Centre for Advancement actually operate and how will it achieve that overall aim. And that's pretty much all I have to say.